Ready? You guys are good? And you're recording.
Good evening. I'd like to welcome you all. This is the March 10th, 2022 meeting of the Board of Fire Commissioners at Company One Firehouse, Newington, Connecticut. And I'd like to start by all rising for the Pledge of Allegiance.
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Can we remain standing for 1 second for a moment of silence for our fallen brother firefighter Jim Lamar for the town of Rocky Hill, and for all of our Ukrainian firefighter friends that are going through a very difficult time at this moment. Thank you.
Amen.
Okay, attendance is being, we'll pass the attendance around. Approval of prior minutes, prior meeting minutes from February 10th. Get a motion.
I looked through them and I find that they're accurate, so I'll make a motion that we accept them as presented.
Second motion.
Okay, all in favor? Aye, thank you. And now we'll move on to public participation. So anybody from the public can call in if you're on Zoom. The instructions are on the board. You can go to the telephone or through the Zoom app, or if there's anybody in person that would like to speak, we'd love to hear from you. Anybody?
Nobody's raised their hand.
Nobody raised their hand. Give it another couple seconds. All right. Nobody? DJ?
Nope.
All right. Communications.
Communication. We have monthly reports from Chief Traumer, Chief Stegmeyer, DJ Zorn, Fire Marshal, and I have one additional piece of recording. That would be from Chief Stegmeyer on the promotions for command staff, which was overlooked. So that is added to this month, and I want to congratulate Miranda Gallagher, Timothy Sullivan, Anita Maria, and Joanna Sistuli, all being promoted. You had 3 staff lieutenants, 2 to the quartermaster division and 2 to the cadet division.
And I would like to add one more to that, and that would be a line officer's position for Company One for Lieutenant Kevin Ziegler, who was just promoted within the last couple of weeks.
Thank you, Commissioner.
So,
Motion to accept the communications as presented.
all in favor?
Aye.
Thank you. All right. Any other, the communications you also. Ledger status, Commissioner Steyer.
I just looked through it briefly and I don't find any issues. Do we have any issues with stuff on our ledger?
Nope.
Chief, we're doing okay?
We're doing very well, and to move some money around and get some more stuff spent.
We should be good till
We should be very
end
good.
of June.
Good shape. Told me.
Very,
I'll make a motion, we accept the ledger status as presented.
Second.
thank you. So moved. Old business. So whoever's department this falls under, you guys can chime up as needed. Radio system update.
The radio system update is, we met with Keith Chapman and Paul Bootsat, went over our numbers. Myself and Commissioner Stoddard met with them, and everything's on par. We explained what we needed, and from the agreement that we had from him coming out of that meeting was he was not touching anything to do with the fire department equipment list. That it was moving forward as presented. And I believe Saturday, the 19th is the CIP meeting, which is supposed to be approval for the funds for the radio system to move it forward.
Correct.
So we'll see what happens on the 19th. But from what I'm being told, it looks like it's moving in the right direction.
That'll be awesome. So hopefully
That's a CIP for next year. July
That's a
1st.
that will be
CIP
for
after
July 1st.
That is correct.
So hopefully after July 1st, Chief, we should be,
I mean, I'm hoping everything's going in the right direction. They, once this
Right.
goes through, hopefully they can sign the MOUs and start moving forward with the purchase.
that'll be
It's
awesome.
still a year before it gets installed, roughly, by the time they get everything ordered and installed, so. But let's cross our fingers. I think we're in good shape, though.
Excellent. Excellent.
Just one thing for the commission, and I know that Chief Tremor and I were starting with the preliminary for ISO review. So that should be an important point of interest for that radio system that they keep that in mind for our ISO rating.
Okay.
Yeah, we just got asked to do an ISO review for the department. So.
Okay, why don't we, we'll do a twofold thing, but why don't we bring that up also under new business?
That's fine.
So then we can get that on the agenda and then we can keep it under old business going forward.
That's fine.
Yeah,
Good.
I just want to say about that meeting with Paul and Keith, we started out with them asking for what our 10%, 20%, 30% cuts were. And we explained to them that we couldn't do that. And we ended up with, making the suggestion and him agreeing with us that emergency services get put off to one side and they meet those needs, and then any other radio system stuff, town employees or Board of Ed, that gets done separately through a different process.
Correct.
So it worked very well.
Absolutely.
Excellent. It's just good to hear that all the departments are working together and but let's hope it goes through because it's in dire need of replacement and let's hope we can keep a few Band-Aids on it for the next year or so till we get the new system, and it's just great to see everybody working together. Thank you.
biggest problem for council. Hopefully that hangs in there. It's on threads.
But you're talking about people.
So we should be good. Truck 2 update.
So Jack is not here, he's on vacation, but the truck 2 update is that we got all the graphics back. We got all the sign-offs on it. It's actually at Pierce right now. Everything Mike needed for questioning is taken care of. And pretty much everything is in the moving forward stage. I would believe we would start seeing progress on the Firematic website pretty soon with the actual build itself. But all the graphics, everything's all signed off on and ready to go.
And we're tentatively looking,
I would say tentatively September, October before it's done, but that depends on everything.
like COVID.
I mean, it could be pushed off, with the computer chips and all that stuff, who knows?
Okay.
It's all gonna depend on how everything falls in place.
Okay.
They may not
Good.
be able to get them there.
Exactly.
Right.
But I know recently South Kensington, Berlin, they just got new trucks from Pierce. And they were pretty much right on schedule, so.
Excellent. Excellent. Grant update, so we can make that generic for whatever we have out there.
We have the AFG grant for the radio system that's submitted, and what we were told is they're gonna award those earlier this year. So we're probably not gonna have to wait until the August, September
Oh,
timeframe.
good.
But I think they were shooting May, June is what we heard. I don't have that as a definite. And then we have the Safer grant that we put in for the signage out front for recruitment and retention. Those I hear, those are awarded early also,
Excellent.
but I don't have any dates.
And just to reiterate, we attended a meeting for the Firehouse subs grant at the town council meeting. They approved it and they forwarded that. Janet has finalized all the paperwork on that and submitted it to Firehouse grants. So we're just waiting for the funds to be transferred and then we will purchase the equipment. I would estimate anywhere from 3 to 4 months roughly by the time we put the order in to the time it gets delivered here. So.
Great. Just for the people at home that are watching on Zoom, our deputy chief, in charge of the budget, with the help of our grant writers, was seeked and received a grant for $47,000 for personal equipment that is vitally needed by the department. And like Chief Charmer said, the town council approved it on last Tuesday. So it's $47,000 that's coming into the town from a private foundation that the townspeople did not have to fund to get life-saving equipment for this town. So kudos to the command staff and our grant writers, and once again to the Firehouse Subs Foundation. Thank you very, very much from the Newington Fire Commission.
Just on an update on the grants also, there's a lot of time and effort that has went into the grants and trying to save the town money. I want to thank Tommy for doing the work that he's been doing. He's been doing a fantastic job, a lot of hours, a lot of late nights with the grant writer, Zoom meetings constantly. It's and even Chief Stegmeyer working on the recruitment retention part for the signage. It's just there's a lot of hours that go into that, and I appreciate all the hard work from both of you. So thanks on behalf of myself.
Kudos, gentlemen.
Well done.
Just so you guys know, it's not like we fill out a form and we get these grants. It's piles and piles of paperwork.
There's a lot of data that
You
they
know, there's
request.
statistics and it's days and days and days of work.
Lot goes into narratives and, you know, revamping them and making them worded correctly and making sure everything's in there that you should be
Right.
putting in. So,
Right.
but kudos to our grant writer. Did
Yeah,
a fantastic
she's
job
really
with us. And
But she works really weird hours.
So, great. And let's hope we can continue to find them. And if we find them, we promise you we'll be on them and going for them. Thank you, Chief. Update on formal request for company 3 and 4 expansion.
so the update on that is we're trying to put a letter together to submit to the town manager and town council
Right.
for their process. I should have that done probably within a week.
Mhm.
I just want to make sure that we get enough information in there to support it. So we definitely have to get that on the radar going forward in the budget season. I know they're doing something with a standing building committee, so
Right.
this will actually play in perfectly into that. So
Good.
looking forward to it.
Excellent. Well, we'll keep up on it and
Absolutely.
And I think the climate in the town is be able to use that to our advantage with the construction down by the busway and now proposed construction over
Sure.
by Sam's,
sure.
by Lowe's. You know, we got a lot of multifamily units going in,
Right.
high rises and parking garages. we have a couple car washes, so there's a lot of demand that's gonna be placed on our services.
I got a funny feeling with 1,000+ apartments coming in, we're gonna start to get to be a little bit busy around here, so.
Start.
We are busy, but this is just gonna add to our run total, so. All right, good, chief.
It's not under old business, but I want to ask, whatever happens to the Class B uniform?
So the Class B uniforms actually are ready. They're ready. to be
I'm waiting
picked up.
for a call tomorrow from Jeannie. Everything's in with the exception of a couple pieces for certain individuals and belts for everybody. They're not coming until probably the middle of March, but everything's been boxed by company. I'm waiting for a call from her tomorrow, and I'll try to arrange to get that picked up, and we'll try to get those distributed as efficiently as possible.
And we'll speak to you afterwards about that,
Okay.
because somehow she lost your
No.
And I enjoyed these sites.
sizes. Just so you're aware.
Good, excellent.
It's okay. I've been on vacation. I'm size bigger now.
Anything else under old business that we need to address, chief?
The only other thing under old business would be the chief reviews.
Yes.
I just want to let everybody know that we did a chief review of all the chief officers, myself and the Board of Fire Commissioners. We sat each one of them down and went through the reviews one by one. And it went very well. It was a good conversation going back and forth with each one of them. So it was done for each chief officer.
We still
Great.
have to, we still have to do that.
We have one more left. We have one more left, and we'll grab it. And he's a newer chief, so. Great. And with that said, with the chiefs being reviewed, is there any plans for review of any of our staff officers or line officers?
Yeah, so the line,
That really doesn't come under our preview, was more or less really yours.
so the line officer review will probably be after July 1st, since it's their first year. And we'd also like to do a staff review also. So
Right.
we are planning on that, absolutely.
Excellent. Okay, anything else under all business, commissioners, or from anybody else here? All right, new business. Discuss and possible discussion and possible decision regarding a fee schedule for fire marshal's office. So DJ, I'll turn it over to you so you can explain it to us.
Well, there's things that come up throughout the year that we don't necessarily budget for. But the fire prevention code gives us the authority to establish through ordinance a fee schedule. So what I'm looking for is basically your permission to put that forward to you guys. I gave some examples in my report. So some of these things would be a fireworks permit, for example, to say that we are required, along with the fire department, to be out there for X amount of hours, usually no less than 10. We have to pay somebody to do that. That should be a fee that is assessed. So the same thing, it could be fire watch fees. It could be, there's a lot of towns around us are charging for plan review. I don't want to make this a, money generation, but just enough to cover the costs. So with your permission, I'd go ahead and put my recommendations forward. And I didn't know if there was anything else that you guys wanted to specifically look at. Currently, the only thing we really do charge for is blasting, and that's a state regulated fee.
Okay.
DJ, what you submitted, you are only looking at these 3 particular items, or are you looking for more than
No, that was just a sample,
sample?
just so you guys understood kind of where we
Yeah.
were.
Okay.
Those are kind of the hot topic ones. There's a lot of departments that are charging for reports. Mainly an insurance company will come in and say, give us your fire investigation report, and they'll send us a check for $5. But obviously a lot more time and effort goes into those reports. So you know, a fee of, I forget if it was $200 or $250, but they get our whole report. They get our photos. You know, they're basically using our work, so they should have to pay for it.
Right.
Again, I would like to make a formal presentation, you know, with what we would need for you guys to decide what you deem is appropriate. The big discussion would be on plan reviews. Developers come into town, they pay a building permit fee. So do our services fall under that, or should we charge extra? We could also, you'll notice the city of Meriden charges a fast track fee. If somebody wants their plans fast tracked, you can pay extra, and we can support that. We would just have to bring in a staff member to specifically do that plan review. And if they want to pay for that, then that's an option that would be available. So there's a lot of options. And again, this is not, you know, designed to put anybody out of business or, you know, generate money just to have a reserve. It's to cover costs and provide a better service.
Just to piggyback on that, the town manager had requested from us on the fire department side also to have some type of fee schedule for reimbursement from insurance companies on, say, structure fires, car accidents, that type of stuff.
Right.
So we are doing research on that. Chief Stegmeyer has been working on that, trying to get what surrounding towns are charging for that same type of service. There are a handful of towns that are doing it, but we're looking at basically the same thing. So on DJ's behalf, maybe we can incorporate both at the same time and
That's
just
what I,
propose it as an all-in fire department, fire marshal ordinance going forward.
right, that's what I was, I didn't know that, Chief. Thanks for giving me that information. That maybe the two of you can, EJ and
Yeah, absolutely.
Jeff and his staff can work collaboratively, come up with a plan from surrounding towns, whatever. Bring it to us, and I'm sure as an ordinance, we can submit that to the town council, because the town council would have to
So the town,
approve the ordinance.
the town does have a fee schedule already. They have an ordinance for fees. So whatever fees we propose, they would vote on and incorporate our fees.
Right.
So we don't necessarily have to make a new ordinance. It's just
Correct.
updating and
Just
implementing
updating.
our.
And like you said, Chief, and this is, and if anyone's watching from the public, this is in no way to, you know, start a cash cow, for lack of better words, but just to try to cover some fees and look outside the box, keeping our budget low and trying to bring in some extra dollars that possibly the insurance companies pay. And I think it's a great idea.
It's not so much going after the homeowners, it's going after the
Correct.
insurance companies, the back.
Correct.
Well, actually, what's happening, what this would do is, right now, everybody in town pays for it. And this would be collecting for a service that you're providing to an individual. So that whether it be an insurance company or a business or whatever it is.
Right.
And while we're on the subject of fees, I had a conversation with Representative Carrie Wood 2 weeks ago. And she told me that herself and Representative Gary Turco are working on legislation to reimburse the fire departments that handle emergencies on the Berlin Turnpike.
That is correct. There's actually
That already is an ordinance. Of
Yeah.
That was taken back.
There's actually,
Yeah.
so there is a bill being proposed by those two individuals. I believe it's on the public safety side. That there was gonna be $700 a year plus, depending on what type of calls there was. It's still going through the process,
Yeah.
but there is proposed legislation out there that they're looking to do.
Good.
So it would extend from Weathersfield all the way to Marion, any of those towns that are involved in that section of 5 and 15. Plus a couple other side routes somewhere else, not in this area. I forgot what they were. There are a couple other areas, 4 or 5 different.
Yeah,
roads.
she didn't tell me specifically, but I know that used to be in play here
It wasn't.
like 20 or 25
Yes.
years ago.
Yeah.
And they did away with it for some reason.
And I believe the fire department also with Chief Trummer, past Chief Trummer. Wasn't it if we went to a state building for a fire alarm or something,
Yeah,
you would get reimbursed $200 or whatever from the state for any fire alarm or response to a state-owned building too, I believe, so. Wow,
that
good,
all went away.
all went away. Well, good, we'll keep it on the agenda and see where it goes, and, if DJ and Chief Trummer, if you guys can collaborate on that with your staff and, see what we can come up with, that'd be great.
Absolutely.
Definitely in favor of it, commissioners.
Absolutely,
absolutely.
absolutely.
Okay, great, thank you. Discussion on engine 2 replacement,
All right, so again, Jack's not here, so I'll step in for this one.
okay?
So recently, I shouldn't say recently, over the last 5 to 7 years, the highway garage has been monitoring engine 5. There's a rust issue on the frame rails, and it's progressively getting worse.
Right.
So Hermes had proposed to the finance director to try to move engine 2 up a year in the financial schedule. Unfortunately, it doesn't sit in the lease payment agreement. It's scheduled for next year,
Okay,
not this year. So Hermes tried to move it up a year. She said, unfortunately, she doesn't have that ability to do that.
okay,
It would have to be at a town council level
right,
to move it up to this year. You know, it's something that we definitely have to keep on the radar. I mean, we can ask to see what happens. You know, it wouldn't hurt to see if we can move it up a year.
my only concern with that is pretty much this year's budget is
Correct. It's pretty much locked in right
kind
now.
of locked in, and I wouldn't really want to rock the boat on that right now.
I mean, it might be just something to get out there that we submit, just, you know, something in writing, just in case something happens down the road,
Okay,
that we have to take that piece off the line.
okay,
The highway garage will monitor it completely. If they deem it any roadworthy safety issues, we're not talking engine 2, we're talking engine 5, but engine
Correct.
2 will go into engine 5 spot.
correct,
And the new engine 2 will be, you know, obviously go back to station 2.
right,
So, you know, maybe it's something we just write just so that they're aware of it. And
So
then,
just-
then make the decision.
let the town know that we're monitoring it and
Good.
something may happen, we'll keep our fingers crossed.
Correct.
Okay, that's good. Yeah, I'm in favor of Chief Charmer, you can, you know,
We'll work on that.
we'll work on that.
Yeah.
All right, great. Anything else under new business? Anybody else have anything else?
You want
under
to
new
put the
business?
ISO review?
Yes,
All right, so recently we were contacted by ISO. I believe we did the ISO review approximately 10 years ago, roughly.
Yeah.
The ISO contacted us to make sure that the ISO review, just to make sure that we're staying on our, you know, the ISO schedule, that we're
it's
still at.
been that long since we got the rating of 3,
No, Chief
10
took
years.
hand close to it.
It's
Wow,
it's
been
been a
that
while.
long, wow.
So, Assistant Chief Lobbyer, Chief Regina, and Chief Nesbata are gonna take that task on doing the ISO review, getting all the paperwork, scheduling the meetings with the lady. And basically, that's a huge task in itself
Oh, it's
again.
huge.
It's basically a lot of documents that have to be provided. And, but it's crucial for every business, residential property, and everybody in the town of Newington to keep our ISO rating where it is. So
Right.
we'll work as hard as we can to keep it where it is. We have one of the best ratings for the
We
volunteer
have the
department.
best you can get.
We're at a 3 right now, and you can't get much better than that. So we're gonna try to maintain it and do what we can to get all the paperwork that they need.
Just for the benefit of those watching, would you explain what ISO stands for?
Good question.
Insurance Service Organization.
There you go. Insurance Service Organization. It's basically your property insurance is based off of the ISO rating
Correct.
for the town of Newington. That's businesses, residential, and so forth in town.
Right.
And the lower our ISO is, the better insurance rating you get and insurance premiums you pay.
Lower premium.
Lower premiums mean better. So
Thanks for business.
it's crucial for us to stay where we're at, and I think we're in very good shape to keep our number. We've improved, I believe,
We have.
from the last review that we had, so I think we're being really good shape.
But there's many things that as we move into this budget climate, you know, the radios being one, that's crucial. Because that's set up to have have a radio per seat, which is required. So there's a lot of requirements that our budgets have been working towards meeting and exceeding those requirements through our normal budget process.
And even firehouse replacements, where they're placed, you know, geographically
How
in
many,
town.
how many
How many
trucks you have?
actually need, how many trucks you have, that type of stuff. How many are active, how many are reserve, and all that incorporates into it.
Yeah.
Hydrants are
Fire
incorporated,
hydrants,
dispatching, everything.
how many firemen you have, and what system you use to dispatch your guys. It's
There's a lot.
very entailed. I know, I'm not sure what our surrounding towns have for an ISO rating. But I know we have a 3, and you can't get any better than a 3 for a volunteer fire department. And from some of my research that I've done, there is paid fire departments in the state that don't even have a 3 and are at a 4 or a 4A or however they classify it. So, yeah, a 3 for a volunteer department is huge. And it's because of the people that are in this department. So let's hope we stay at a 3. It's gonna be a lot of work, chief, but we'll do it.
We'll get through it.
We'll get through it.
One of the things we didn't talk about under old business was the portable computers and the engines.
Okay, so you're talking the tablets and
Yeah.
the computers. So we recently had a meeting with Paul Boots the other day to discuss that project. The fire marshal's office and ourselves were kind of deciding on which way we were going. The fire marshals decided on their piece. They forwarded that to the Paul, and we're all set with our side. So that's all submitted, and Paul's supposed to be working that up to get that submitted. So, you know, that's part of the budget process also.
Okay, so that'll be in, that's, I thought that was in this year, but
No, that's
I
July.
think it's
It's
July
July.
1st, DJ. That was
July
after
1st.
July, right?
I don't know.
Yes,
Yeah. it
there's
might
all
be
the amounts and
CIP.
everything that we
yeah.
put in for July 1st.
So the software is also in there for our transfer from Firehouse over to Alpine software.
Yeah.
Is also in CIP.
For July 1st.
Because the end of life for Firehouse,
Right.
the way we have it today is December 31st.
Right, because that's
So
not
we
gonna be
have to transfer
supported
over.
anyway.
That's correct. They went to a more cloud-based system. It's geared more towards paid departments. That we have noticed.
Good.
So, but we put that in our budget also for the full software replacement for that also.
Excellent. Costs a few bucks to stay up into the 21st century, but
Sure does.
excellent. Anything else? All right, well, we'll move on to public participation for the final time. If anybody would like to speak using the Zoom application, you're more than welcome to follow directions on the screen. We'd love to hear from our residents and our members here. Anybody have anything?
I just have a couple things. I just want to commend this department for the 2 incidents that we recently had. The tragic accident that was up at East Cedar Street and Patricia Genova. Our membership worked fantastic. It was a horrific scene to deal with. Our members dealt with it and did a phenomenal job. Hats off to all of you. We work very well with the police department, EMS, and I think the two organization worked very well with each other. And I was very pleased with the actions of every one of our members that was at that scene that day. And I can't thank Weatherfield enough also. They sent their rescue truck immediately to that scene and was ready to go to work. So kudos to everybody that was at that scene. Guys, hats off, worked unbelievably and safely and just diligently. We tried to maintain the scene as much as possible during the extrications, and the PD was very appreciative of that. So I can't thank every one of them, every one of our guys. The second one was the call at Stonegate Apartments, where we had a fire in the basement. Still had people home and that were in their apartments. Again, the department responded, did a fantastic job. We held the fire to the basement area and basically did a fantastic job. So kudos
With
to
no
every single-
injuries.
with 0 injuries at both incidents.
Yep.
So I just want to thank every single one of you for what you did.
Thank you, Chief. Anybody? Chief Trummer. Past Chief.
I just want to stand up here and give praise to this department. I've been out of here for 17 years. The training is next to none. It's phenomenal. From what I hear on the radio every day, it's just take charge, get it done, let's go home. And you guys make this department, and not only here, but statewide, you're recognized, whether you know it or not. There's so many radios out there listening to you people. It's just phenomenal. I'm so proud of this department, each and every one that's here. And remember one thing, everybody has to go to fires. You can't just have 1 or 2 people. Everybody is part of this family that should be sharing, not one person.
Thank you, Chief.
Very proud of you.
You want to put an application back in, Chief? We can use you again. We miss you. Anybody else would like to talk? Mr. Ziegler, you got something on your mind over there? No? I'll save my comments for last, so other commissioners, Commissioner Stoddard?
Yes, I'd like to get on the bandwagon with both the Trommers. I think that things have been going very well. I think that I was out of town for both of those incidents, and from what I've heard, the department did a great job. So I appreciate all the work everybody does, and I would like to see more of it. I don't want to see more fires. I just want people to work together, and I'm glad to hear that we worked well with EMS and the police department, because sometimes that doesn't always work that way. That's all I got for tonight.
Okay, Commissioner Stoddard, thank you.
You're welcome.
And Commissioner DeMayo, what was on your mind tonight?
Well, I'm basically gonna say pretty much what everybody else has said. I was present at both of those incidents. And I'm getting used to knowing a lot more individuals, and I'm watching how this department operates, and it just totally amazes me how well everyone works together. And especially accidents seen on Cedar Street. I watched from a distance between police, fire, and EMS, and there wasn't anything that was overlooked by any one of the agencies, and everybody did an awesome job. So my hat's off to you, Chief, for running the department the way it's run, to all of your officers, your staff people, the cadets, everybody, top to bottom, top shelf.
Anything else, Commissioner?
No, I'm good.
So the kudos, I don't want to repeat what everybody said, but they're my sentiments exactly. But the one thing I would like to add to it is on Saturday morning, the Newington Fire Department participated in a drive-by for a very special friend of the fire department, who was Rocky Hill fireman there, just recently passed the other day, and he's in our thoughts and prayers. But why I was participating in this drive-by, a couple members from another out-of-town agency came up to me, and they weren't involved in fire, they were involved in police, that were at the tragedy on Cedar Street a couple weeks ago. And them knowing that I was a commissioner in the fire department, came up to me and made sure that I knew that this was one of the best fire departments that these police officers have worked with. These officers routinely go to tragedies like this through a group of officers that they're involved with that investigate these type of accidents. And they couldn't praise the Newington Fire Department enough for their professionalism, their work ethic, their courtesy, their scene preservation. And it was just so good to hear from, when you get it from a guy that's in the town, it's like, great, thank you. But when you hear it from these professionals that come from another community to our town and tell you this, it's just very heartfelt. And it says a lot about our members, our family, which you've heard me stress it a million times. It's our family. And it's because of our command staff and the dedication of our members that this department is ranked probably, I'd put them up against anybody. And it's just great news to hear. So that's all I'd like to say. If anybody has anything else or a motion to adjourn.
We don't have an executive session.
We do not have an executive session.
Will we adjourn?
Second.
Okay, so moved. Thank you.
Thank you, folks.
We're done.
You guys sign?
Yeah.
You sign?
Yeah.
I'll put that on the desk. Thanks, guys.